Hi, I'm Mark from Whiteacre Legal, and today's topic is about property law, more specifically encroachments, and what you can do if your neighbour's building or other structure encroaches on your land. Now, as always, remember that this video is meant for educational purposes only. It's no substitute for legal advice, and please don't take legal advice from a video that you see on a website or on YouTube. Your personal situation is unique to you, and that can often change the nature of the advice that you get from a solicitor. So please visit our website if you do have an issue like this and get in contact with us. I will make these slides that I'm working from today available via our website, and you're free to go there and download them, but please don't take advice from a video. Right, now that we've got that out of the way, let's move on to the topic today of encroachments. In New South Wales, there's specific legislation dealing with encroachments. It's the Encroachment of Buildings Act, and this act gives the New South Wales Land and Environment Court the power to resolve disputes about encroachments, specifically or commonly disputes between neighbours about encroachments on land. So who can bring an action? Well, under the Act, only the owner of the land can bring an action to the court. So that's the owner or the holder of the title to the land, and that doesn't extend to tenants. Before we go further, we need to talk about what an encroachment is, and there's a specific definition under the Act. Under the Act, it's defined as a substantial building of a permanent character. Now, don't be put off by that definition. It's actually been interpreted rather broadly, a substantial building of a permanent character. It's been held to mean protruding floor beams, for example, the concrete foundation for a fence. There's a number of things that have been held to satisfy that. So it's quite a broad definition. Right, well, what does it mean to encroach or to encroach upon somebody's land? Again, this is a pretty common sense sort of description, and here we're talking about one structure or building extending over the boundary line onto a neighbouring property. So if you imagine two properties next to each other, a boundary line down the middle, when one structure or other building on one side extends across that common boundary line, that's what we mean by the word encroach. Now, interestingly, the encroachment doesn't need to have arisen by a deliberate act of trespass. It can be unintentional. The question is one of fact. Does it encroach or doesn't it? How it came to be that way is largely irrelevant for these purposes. It's just a matter of, does it extend over the boundary line? Right, well, if the court finds that there is an encroachment, what can the court do about it? And there's pretty much three things that the court can do. Firstly, the court can order the payment of compensation for the encroachment. Secondly, the court can award certain rights. So the court can convey part of the land to one or the other of the property owners, a lease over that part of the land. It can convey certain rights in that land to either of the parties. And thirdly, although this is less common, the court can order that the encroachment be removed. Now, what does the court take into account when choosing between these three options? Well, there's a number of factors that the court will consider when deciding between those three options. I won't go into too much detail on that, but some of those factors are the situation and the value of the land that is subject to the encroachment. The court will also consider the character and the nature of the building or the structure that's encroaching. Obviously, it will treat, say, for example, an extended fence differently to the way it would treat, say, the supporting wall of a house that's encroaching on land. It might treat those two differently. The court will also consider the loss and damage to the encroaching owner if that owner is forced to remove the encroachment. And it will also consider the loss and damage to the person who is burdened, the owner of the land that is burdened by that encroachment on the land. And finally, the court will also consider the circumstances in which the encroachment came about or was made. Now, importantly, this list is not exhaustive, and the court will also consider other factors as well. One of the things that the court will consider is whether or not the encroachment has been allowed to remain. So if you own the land and you have permitted with full knowledge that encroachment to remain for 20 or 30 years, that will be a factor that the court will take into account. Interestingly, another factor that the court will consider is whether or not when you bought the property you were aware of the encroachment, and sometimes the court will deem that when you bought the property you received a discount on the purchase price of the property because the encroachment was there, and then that was factored into the purchase price, rightly or wrongly. The court will also consider the nature of the encroachment, whether it's a major encroachment over a large piece of land or whether it's just a trifling encroachment. If you're talking about a fence that encroaches by a centimetre or two, well, common sense would dictate that that might not be a matter that you'd want to take all the way through court. Okay, so we've talked about what an encroachment is, what the court can do about it. Let's talk now about when the court can order compensation. The payment of compensation is entirely in the court's discretion, but payment of compensation is the normal rule. However, that doesn't mean that compensation is payable in every case. Sometimes, in the interests of fairness and justice, the payment of compensation or an order for compensation is not made. And again, going back to that example I used before, if, for example, an owner of land bought that land with full knowledge of the encroachment and they negotiated a discount in the purchase price because of that encroachment, well then it would hardly be fair that they get to double dip and the neighbour has to pay them compensation for something that they'd already been compensated for by a reduced purchase price. However, as I said, payment of compensation is the ordinary rule, but the big question is, well, how much? And typically the amount will be the unimproved capital land value of that land that is encroached upon. So say, for example, the encroachment is a metre in from the boundary and 5 metres long. Well, that's 5 square metres. So the per square metre rate times 5, and that would be the amount of compensation that might be awarded if the encroachment was unintentional. So the encroaching owner satisfies the court that it was unintentional and not arising out of negligence. Now, if the encroaching owner deliberately encroached or can't satisfy the court of those factors, then the court can award compensation of 3 times the land value. So again, going back to that example of 5 square metres, if the unimproved land value of a square metre is $1,000, well then the court will multiply that by 3 and times it by 5 for that 5 square metre space. Now sometimes that can cut both ways. I've had circumstances in the past where a builder has accidentally encroached on land and the neighbour has come to the builder and said, well, we want compensation of $200,000, and the builder has come to me and said, look, that's ridiculous. It's a 1 square metre of encroachment. We expect that land would actually be worth $5,000. Why would we pay them $100,000 or $200,000 for that encroachment? Equally, going the other way, if you have a building that substantially encroaches on land in, Double Bay in Sydney, for example, well then the amounts that we're talking about could be substantial. Moving on now to costs, and this is always the question that I get about who pays the costs for these things. Who pays the costs of the lawyers and going to court to have this matter resolved? Well, in this jurisdiction, the normal rule is that the loser pays. In law, that's called that costs follow the event. So the winner is awarded their costs for bringing the action. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes the court can make an order that both parties pay their own costs. For example, that might arise if both parties had purchased their properties recently. They didn't build the encroachment, they just discovered it later, and no one was deliberately at fault. Maybe the court in that circumstance will say, well, both parties need to pay their own costs. They wouldn't make a cost order. But the usual course of things is that if you are successful in a claim like this, then you would have your costs awarded. Let's talk quickly about costing in these cases. People often have a misunderstanding that you get the entire amount of your costs back. Well, that's not the case. The court will ask that you prepare a schedule of costs, which is often less than the solicitors or the legal costs that you've incurred. So typically you get in the ballpark of say 60 to 70% of your costs back on a good day. So you won't get 100% of them back in most cases. All right, now having said that, it's always worth discussing these issues with your neighbour first before you commence an action. However, in my experience, especially given that you can be held to have waived your right in this jurisdiction, it's often important to put your neighbour on notice that you object to the encroachment and that you will be seeking to take some action in relation to the encroachment. For this reason, it's important that you get competent legal advice on your rights and what you can do about this situation if you find that your neighbour has encroached upon your land, or in fact if you are encroaching on your neighbour's land. Okay, so that's a general overview of encroachments. As always, you can make your way to our Whiteacre website and download a copy of these slides, get in contact with us for free. And as always, please subscribe to our channel and hit like and comment in the comments below. That does wonders for our YouTube metrics and we really appreciate it. Okay, thanks for watching and take care.